Have you ever wondered what the world was like just before the assassination of President John F. Kennedy? A world fraught with Cold War tensions to begin with. Kennedy's presidency was a high-wire act of diplomatic finesse and political brinkmanship, played out on the world stage against the backdrop of the Cold War. Geopolitical tension between the United States and the Soviet Union was at its peak. The threat of nuclear war was a constant, chilling presence. This period saw the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, a failed attempt by the US to overthrow the Cuban government, further straining relations between the superpowers. But it was the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962 that brought the world perilously close to nuclear conflict. Kennedy's deft handling of this crisis averted catastrophe, but the stakes could not have been higher. The world was at the brink of nuclear conflict, a stage set for high-stakes politics. The early 1960s was not just about global politics. It was also a time of significant internal changes and challenges. As the tension of the Cold War simmered, America was undergoing a significant societal shift at home. The Civil Rights Movement, a struggle for social justice and equality for African Americans, was gaining momentum. Initially, President Kennedy was cautious about fully endorsing the movement. He was aware of the political tightrope he was walking, balancing the demands of Southern segregationists and the burgeoning call for civil rights. However, as the movement grew stronger and more vocal, Kennedy ultimately backed it, proposing comprehensive civil rights legislation. This move, while progressive, stoked opposition from segregationists and added another layer of pressure to his administration. Simultaneously, another significant event was unfolding halfway around the world. The Vietnam War, a conflict that would go on to define an era, was escalating under Kennedy's administration. His policy of supporting the South Vietnamese government with military advisors was a response to the domino theory, the fear that if one state in a region came under the influence of communism, then the surrounding countries would follow. This policy laid the groundwork for what would later become a full-scale and deeply controversial war. These two major issues, the Civil Rights Movement and the Vietnam War, were intertwined with the broader Cold War context. The fight for civil rights at home reflected America's ideological battle against communism's perceived threat to freedom and democracy. Similarly, the escalation in Vietnam was a manifestation of the Cold War's geopolitical struggle. So as the early 1960s rolled on, America found itself grappling with significant challenges both at home and abroad. The nation was divided internally, with the civil rights movement causing a seismic shift in society, and externally threatened by the escalating conflict in Vietnam and the overarching specter of the Cold War. A nation divided internally and under threat externally, the stage was set for political turmoil. Amidst the turmoil, there were points of national pride and international competition. One such point was Kennedy's commitment to the space race. The 1960s was a time of rapid technological advancement and intense rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. Kennedy's audacious promise to land an astronaut on the moon by the end of the decade embodied America's determination to lead in this new frontier. The space race was more than a scientific endeavor. It was a peaceful channel for the superpowers to demonstrate their prowess, yet it demanded significant resources and focus. Meanwhile, on the geopolitical front, relations with Cuba were deteriorating rapidly. The aftermath of the Bay of Pigs invasion, a failed attempt by the CIA to overthrow Fidel Castro, left relations between the United States and Cuba strained to the breaking point. Kennedy's administration faced criticism at home for the botched operation, and internationally the incident served to further isolate Cuba and push it closer to the Soviet Union. The ripple effects of this failed invasion were far-reaching, contributing to an atmosphere of heightened tension and mistrust. These challenges, the lofty goals of the space race and the fraught relations with Cuba, painted a complex picture of Kennedy's presidency. The world was watching the US, but so were its enemies. The threats were not just external or ideological, they were also very real and very dangerous. The Kennedy administration found itself in a complicated web of relations with organized crime figures and militant anti-Castro Cuban exiles. These groups had a bone to pick with Kennedy. They felt betrayed after the Bay of Pigs invasion, where Kennedy did not provide the air support they were counting on. Their disappointment fueled hostility towards the president, and a sense of vengeance began to simmer in the underworld. But the threats were not just from the shadows. The political climate in the United States was heating up. Kennedy was gearing up for the 1964 presidential election, but the road ahead was rocky. The country was deeply divided. From the South, Kennedy faced considerable animosity due to his stance on civil rights. His policies were seen as a threat to the long-standing way of life. In contrast, some factions in the North felt he wasn't progressive enough. They wanted more change, faster change. Kennedy was caught in the crosshairs of these opposing viewpoints. He was steering the ship of state through stormy waters with threats looming on the horizon. This was the backdrop against which Kennedy was making his decisions, his moves, his gambles. It was a high-stakes game, and the tension was palpable. A deeply divided country and hostile groups, the stage was set for tragedy. And in this charged atmosphere, a man named Harvey Oswald and a trip to Texas would change the course of history. Oswald, a man with a complex past, had a dishonorable discharge from the US Marine Corps under his belt. He had defected to the Soviet Union only to return with a Russian wife. His Marxist beliefs and support for Fidel Castro had caught the attention of the FBI, and he was under surveillance. Meanwhile, President Kennedy was planning a trip to Texas, a political move aimed at mending fences with factions within the Texas Democratic Party ahead of the 1964 election. Dallas, a city where sentiment against him was especially strong, was on the itinerary. It was in this city, amidst the swirling tensions of the time, that Oswald and Kennedy's paths would tragically intersect. A man under surveillance and a trip to a hostile city. The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place. The world was never the same after that fateful day in Dallas. Retracing the critical points leading up to JFK's assassination has been a profound journey. If you found this journey through time enlightening, please subscribe, like this video, and hit the notification bell to stay updated on future content. Remember, history is always unfolding.